encounters in a spreadsheet that's really interesting because it shows you over time and location. But why it matters, this is what I think is important for us and our listeners and viewers. Why it matters about USOs. We've talked about this a lot, George. You talked about why the water, right? So Richard brings up a few things about this. He goes, you can hide there. Water is steady, no wild swings in heat or cold compared to atmosphere. Water, he said, is incompressible. It offers pressure consistency compared with the air. The water also protects the cosmic rays and meteorites. Water might be the cosmic constant in a way for life out in the universe. What if aliens themselves come from water? So this idea that why the water is so important to the UFO topic or USO topic is because it might be this kind of nest where these things can come and go because there's not an irregularity of pressure differences in heat and cold, and water might be abundant through our vast universe. So that's always intrigued me. I know people have said this back in the past, but this is a time when we're really looking at it because we can, with modern technology. Do you think that's the same, George, or do you feel the same way that water plays a big role with the way that UFOs and USOs might be hiding from humanity?
I mean, absolutely. It would make sense. Either they've arrived more recently and need a place to hide away from prying human eyes, or they've always been here. Maybe they've always lived down there. Maybe that's their basic home. Richard tackles some of those kinds of questions. What I like about him is the thoroughness, the meticulous research that he's always done. He's written several books that are absolute mandatory if you're going to be serious about the topic. UFOs in the National Security State, which I think was supposed to start as one book and then became two, and I don't know, it might still be three out there at some point. But I like Richard because of the depth and breadth of his knowledge on the topic, the fact that he still has a sense of humor, and the fact that he still has a sense of curiosity. A lot of people lose it, when they get UFO disease, and they want, all right, I don't want to hear any more cases or historical incidents. Show me the bodies right now, or I'm going to go home and suck my thumb and not paying attention to it anymore. But he is the preeminent historian in the topic. This new book, part one of 3 volumes, is outstanding. And I agree with you that the whole topic of USOs and what other intelligences might be living in the waters, in the oceans and lakes, has been largely ignored. Richard does a great job of digging up older cases, some of which were completely overlooked forever, some of which have been forgotten. And, it's like mining this great resource of information that's already available that most of UFO world completely ignores. So I really enjoyed reading it. I can't wait to go back and read it again slowly, and I can't wait to bring him on.
All right, well, let's do it, because since UFOs are trans-medium, let's dive in. Richard, how you doing, man?
Hey, guys, George, Jeremy, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction. That was very nice. I have one correction. I have to say this. That spreadsheet you mentioned, it's not 172 cases on there. It is 672 cases. And I'm only saying this because I am not a spreadsheet guy. That was the first spreadsheet in my life that I put together, and it was brutal. That's a 37-page document. So I put a lot in there, and it's free. People can go download it on the website. You can look at that later. But thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to talk to both of you.
Rich, let me ask you this. Was there an incident or a case that sort of started you down this path of looking at USOs? If so, what that was? And did you know when you started how big this would get?
Yeah, I did. I didn't really anticipate it would be this encompassing. The case, it's a fantastic case. So about 3 years ago, for my website, I've got really great, cool members there, and I'll do like different posts and video stuff or audio podcasts I'll do for them. So this one was on a case from 1945 by the Aleutian Islands, and it's one of the last UFO cases of World War II, or the last Foo Fighter cases, or whatever we want to call that, in the summer of 45. So Japan was still fighting, Germany had surrendered, and there was a U.S. transport ship coming back from Japan to Seattle, and they're passing by a tiny little island called Adak Island on the Aleutian Island chain. You would never want to go there for a vacation. It's utterly remote. It's brutal weather. It's terrible. High winds, all of that, northern Pacific. Even in the summertime, it's rough. So a transport ship is coming back there, and the men on this ship saw a disc-shaped object come out of the water, circle around their ship twice. It's a classic flying saucer, apparently. And then it just kind of zipped off. It was totally silent. It never, it didn't tilt when it banked. It just stayed level. It was absolutely silent. And about 15 years later, one of those crew members, his name is Robert Crawford, spoke to a number of UFO researchers, including a famous one, Dr. James McDonald, who's very, very well known, great researcher at the time. Extensive interview. And so we have Crawford's testimony about this. Crawford always stated that he personally did not see the object come out of the water, but that other members of the crew did, and that he saw it when it was just above the water, rising up and circling. He watched it circle the ship. His testimony has been reviewed by a lot of other experienced researchers of the time. No one's had any problem with him. I think it's a great case, and it's not the only USO incident from that region. It's an absolutely remote area. The Aleutian Islands, it's right between the U.S. and Russia there, and but there have been a number of other cases that are UFO, USO activities from that region. It's just fascinating. That's what got me started, and I'll just complete the thought, I guess. So, in the spring and summer of 2022, I thought, wow, that was an interesting little thing there. Let's keep going. I started looking for some more USO cases because, I mean, anyone who follows this subject for any length of time knows that the water aspect of this is really interesting. I mean, inherently, it's fascinating. It's like, all right, so it's one thing to see something zigzag in the air. That's really fascinating. That's cool. But to come out of the water, let's just get real here. That's like an extra step of crazy or an extra step of impossible. And yet, we hear about these. And I thought, I know there's cases out there. Where are they? Where are they stored? Like, there's a couple of books, and I mean a couple, in the English language that have been done. The first one was in 1970, and then nothing for more than 30 years. And then we had another one. It was a good book, but that's it, basically. And a couple of others, not much. And so I thought, I want to collect these. I want to see where they are. So I hunted down different databases, online stuff, the National UFO Reporting Center. MUFON was really helpful to me. A gentleman named Carl Feint, who's no longer with us, he did really good work on this. And he had a now kind of semi-defunct website where he collected some cases. So I pilfered through all of them. I found a lot of old books, magazines, how to print things, lots of those. And I thought, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to find the good ones, not include the bad ones, and see what happens. And it morphed into a big statistical analysis. And I ended up getting an amazing illustrator who just did incredible renditions of it, and I put in a bunch of maps, and it just kept going. And I really loved this project. It was maybe my favorite project ever to do. Because it was just so mind-blowing. The cases, these historical cases, I realize there are people who are like, who cares about the 1950s? Well, I'll tell you, if you read these cases from the 1950s, you just might care because they are absolutely fascinating. And so, and I'll just mention the second and third volumes are all written, the cases, I should say, are all done. All of them, and it's just I'm going to organize them into kind of a nice book format, but all of that is in the works, and I think they'll all be out by middle of the year.
You know, people are looking for understanding and knowledge about the UFO topic. Forget all these cases from years gone by. They just either they never read about them to begin with, or they think that they're outdated. But you as a historian, you dig back into this stuff, you dig up sources and original material, and it's like finding golden nuggets. There's a great deal of stuff that really sheds light on what's going on now, right?
It blew my mind, George. Honestly, I thought I had a good handle on UFO case history. I think I do. You know what? Most of these cases that I found, I'd never heard of before. A couple of them are famous. Maybe later we can talk about the Nimitz Tic Tac case of '04. That goes into volume 3. And as you both know very well, there's a USO element to that. But most of these cases are not that well known. In this first volume, most people who've studied this may have heard of the Shag Harbor case. And that's a good one, absolutely. But there's hundreds of others that are honestly every bit as riveting, and they've just been forgotten, discarded. And I thought, I don't like that. I want these people who experience these incredible moments in their lives, just the most incredible thing they've ever experienced. And not only are they forgotten, it's almost like they were never remembered to begin with. And so I just thought it's not right, and I want to resuscitate these cases to some extent. And that's what I tried to do. That's basically it.
What I loved about reading your book, this first one, Richard, is like you're showing us these statistics. You're doing better than Arrow at cataloging and telling the public what's going on. You said that transmedium capabilities were reported in 68% of the cases.
Yeah.
So I want to kind of touch upon that. People didn't know what transmedium meant. I said it on Rogan's podcast a long time back. He's like, what? Trans what? I go, transmedium. And he's like, what does that mean? And I'm like, explaining to him the idea that it comes from, space to air to sea, and there's no disturbance a lot of the time when it passes through these mediums. You also said that discs and ovals were the most common, with 22% of all cases in your book. So I just wanted to get I said it at kind of in the intro, but I want to get your perspective. Why is the water element potentially so important for these craft? Why is water associated with UFOs so much? Can you tell us why you think? From your
I do. And there's a few things that I would like to add to that. First of all, the really interesting stuff that you, when you were quoting me before you brought me on, I heard that. And I just wanted to mention, I learned a lot of that from Kevin Newth, who is a great guy. He teaches here in New York State where I live. He's highly very smart man who has really studied the water, and I was listening to him talk about this, and he made these fantastic statements about why water would be an attractive medium for any visitors, and he pointed out a number of the things that you mentioned there, so it's totally true. The real question that I'm wondering is the water is it more attractive than working in the atmosphere for them? I'm not really sure myself. There's certainly a lot of action in the oceans and in the bodies of water. There's no question about that. I think when I researched into this, it's obvious there's a lot going on. And what I was able to find, I have no doubt, is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure there's much more that was never reported. But that's also true of ordinary UFOs or UAP. So what's more common? Is it the water or the atmosphere? And I can't say that I know it's the water. I don't know that it's more common, but maybe it is, and we're just not aware. But they're definitely in the water. I sifted through thousands of cases to get to the ones that I thought were really the good ones. But water's attractive. Especially if you are them and you're watching these curious humans who like to stick their nose in everything and who notice everything and would notice you if you start hanging out there, and if you don't want them to be in your face all the time while you're doing whatever you're doing, the water might be a really great place for them to go. It's a protective environment, yes, without a doubt. The pressure is consistent, as you mentioned. Protects from excessive electromagnetism or UV radiation. Those things might be a problem for them, but it definitely keeps them secure, for the most part, from invading human eyes and senses to a large extent. I noticed a few things when I studied these statistics, Jeremy. So it's true, disc-shaped objects were the most common, followed very closely by spherical or orb-type shapes. Those are interesting too. kind of similar to what you get with standard classic UFOs or UAP. But I noticed a few crazy things when I looked at these statistics that I had not expected at all. One of the data points that I tracked for each of these cases, because I did this with all of them. I put down about 15 specific data points for each case, and that's what I put into the spreadsheet. One was, did the thing occur in the daytime or at nighttime? It was very simple. I couldn't really tell, like, was it 2 a.m. or 3 a.m. or that type of thing, but I could tell if it was day or night most of the time. And I noticed an absolutely critical behavioral change from the late 1960s. Prior to, say, 1967 or so, from all the cases that I collected, it was almost exactly 50-50 day and night. Slight advantage to daytime. After 1967, I swear it was like someone flipped a switch and it was 75%, 3/4 were at night. And for military cases, it was even more extreme. Since 1967, almost 90% of military encounters with USOs took place at night. I think it's like 87.5%. It's ridiculous. It's like they can tell the difference between military and non-military craft, because there's definite, much higher likelihood that they'll approach a civilian craft in the daytime for whatever reason. And B, there's a behavioral change from the late 60s. For some reason, they decided to operate much more commonly at night. And that's good to ask. A couple of other things that I noticed. Electromagnetic interference. Man. So I tracked EM interference for all of these. The first case that I detected that was from the early 1950s. So if I just take all of those cases from that point onward, it's about 9.5% of the USO cases I found have some kind of EM interference. It's like 1 out of 10. What's crazy is that military encounters were twice as likely to have electromagnetic interference. It's about 20%, not 10%. And in the few cases where there were reports of either missing time or sightings of beings, and there's some of those, in those cases, you're 4 times more likely to experience electromagnetic interference. And that's not something that I would have thought would be easily predictable, but it's right there in this data. The thing is, when I look at these data points, there's a certain consistency to a lot of them that I would not have expected to see. Like, why are almost all of the triangular USOs described as black? But they are. Why are nearly all of the disc-shaped or cigar-shaped USOs described as silver or gray? Well, they are. There are consistencies in these descriptions that they suggest to me that these stories are accurate. I mean, by and large, these people are telling the truth. And these intelligences that are behind this phenomenon, they're able to adapt to us. They're able to engage in behavioral changes, and they can absolutely, and when we're talking about the Navy, this is important, they can absolutely shut down U.S. aircraft carriers, battle cruisers, all of these things. They can do that. They have the ability to disable them, disable weapon systems, disable communication systems. Some of these come out really loud and clear in the second volume that I will be releasing, but a lot of them are in that first volume as well. And I mean, if you're the U.S. Navy, I can't think of anything that's more important than like your fleet of nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed aircraft carriers, maybe the submarines, but those aircraft carriers are important. And there are cases of those things being shut down by these USOs. It's nuts, but it's right in there.
Share with us one of those. There's a really great one in your book where the U.S. Navy, they basically tried to shoot this thing down, and they failed because all their weapon systems stopped working. Pretty good case.
Yeah. There's a few of these, but one from this volume, one of them took place in 1954, and it was aboard the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt aircraft carrier. Now, the FDR was the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the fleet. Very important. It carried nuclear weapons before very long. Actually, check that. I think it did. I want to be careful about that. But it was nuclear powered. It was the first one for that. And that ship also had a number of UFO sightings throughout its service history, right up until the end of the 1970s. And the one in 1954 wasn't even its first UFO. It actually had one. There was something called Operation Mainbrace in North Atlantic, in the North Sea in 1952, and there was that. But this is a whole other thing. So yeah, you had an officer from the FDR writing years later about this. He did not give his name. Don't know who he is. He was very meticulous in his statement online. And he actually gave a minute-by-minute breakdown of what happened. Like, by the 12th minute, this happened. By the 14th minute, this happened. He was extremely meticulous. But he said, I have a wife and family to think about. I can't give my name. And this is his thing. So here's what happened. So the FDR was in an unnamed body of water. In fact, in 1954, the FDR was going from the Mediterranean for a 2-year-long refitting. And so it had to go to Seattle, which meant it had to go down the Atlantic. It couldn't go through the Panama Canal. It was too big. It had to go around the tip of South America and then up the other side. So somewhere along that massive route, the following thing happened. They're in the water. A very large cigar-shaped object descends from above. It's about 100 feet long, he estimates. It's like whitish, silverish. So they're all looking at this, and the weapon systems did not function. During this, trying to get the exact sequence right, that object ascended high up and was gone, and then 2 disc-shaped objects emerged from the water, and this, either the same or a larger cigar-shaped object descended. It's kind of weird. He said the second one that we saw was like 300 feet in diameter. Otherwise, it looked the same. What's going on here? I mean, I wondered. But anyway, the disc-shaped objects entered this cigar, and that tilted and entered the water. The whole thing lasted about 15, 20 minutes. He said that none of the aircraft that they were going to launch to intercept this would launch. Weapon systems did not function. And that's basically it. It was somewhere along the path when they were on their way to Seattle, I'm sure. I thought, that's one of 4 or 5 cases of the FDR. There was a man who served on the FDR shortly after that. His name was Charles Grzinski. And he was an 18-year-old kid in, I think it was like 1958, when he said, we saw a cigar-shaped object, or some kind of, it looked like a cigar, and he actually said he could saw beings or some kind of silhouettes of people in there. He said, look, everyone on the deck saw this thing. He said there were at least like 40 guys. And I'm trying to remember his details. They certainly were not able to deal with this object, and then it departed. And then Grzinski, after he left the service, stayed in touch with a lot of anyone who served aboard the FDR, and he encouraged many of them to write about their experiences. And it turns out like a bunch of sailors who had served aboard the USS FDR wrote to Grzinski and wrote to various organizations about their encounters as well. We have their names. One was named Leon Treadwell, and there are a bunch of others. So these are known people who we know served aboard the USS Franklin Delano Roosevelt and had similar types of encounters to report for their ship.
Yeah, in that case, in reading that case in your book, you had the exact quote. It was cigar-shaped, had windows. He said, I could see silhouettes of figures looking at us. They had no features, and you could tell they weren't human. And that's right before there was the cherry red flash, apparently, on the bottom side. And then he later said that the CIA boarded the ship under the guise of investigating like a supposed gambling problem.
Oh, right.
And he said it was all a smoke screen, was his exact quote, Grzinski. And that kind of has intonations towards the things we've heard in other cases where there's agencies, even with John Callahan and the aerial sighting, Alaska Airlines, the CIA came in, swooped it all up. You never saw anything. This didn't happen. So apparently that happened all the way back in that USO case in 1958 on the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt.
That's a fantastic point to make, Jeremy, because we are hearing throughout that the CIA keeps sticking its nose into the UFO cover-up. I remembered just a few months ago, Christopher Sharp, a journalist that I really like a lot, had a excellent story where he talked about, apparently, during the last hearing, where in around, I'm guessing 2008, 2009, Lou Elizondo had to be involved in this, where there was an attempt to get some kind of legacy tech from Lockheed Martin to the DIA and the OSAP program. And Chris Sharp wrote about this. And Mike Gold, who was at the hearing, was working, he was working for Bigelow Aerospace at the time, and that's important because this was supposed to be transferred to Robert Bigelow. And we're told that a senior CIA agent or officer, Kevin or Glenn Gaffney, stopped it twice. So again, CIA.
Well, I can tell you that's true. I can tell you absolutely that's true. I've reported it before. I wasn't able to say until after the New York Times story came out, but yeah, they were supposed to get it. It was one of the primary reasons Bigelow signed the contract. He spent $1 million retrofitting one of his aerospace hangars to get this stuff, and then and they were promised it. They had conversations, and then it was stopped by CIA. You have MIB types showing up all over in these instances in your book, and where they take that stuff, I guess we'll never know. It makes sense after you reading about USOs in this book, why the U.S. Navy would be such a key player. I remember when I first met Bob Lazar, and he told me that he worked for the U.S. Navy out there in the desert at Area 51 or S4. It didn't make any sense. Why would the Navy be involved in this? But you look at it, they have a global presence. They have sensor systems that are the best of the world, planes, ships everywhere. And, if in fact there are so many USO incidents, things coming in and out of the oceans, it would make sense that the U.S. Navy would be at the forefront. We always think of Air Force as the supreme bad guys in this whole topic, very uncooperative about UFOs, but the Navy's had a different attitude, especially in recent years.
Totally. And one thing about the Navy, and only recently have I let myself really think this through. I'll probably include some thought on this in the second or third volume, but just imagine, like, you're the U.S. Navy. So, and you've got submarines, so you're under the water, and the Soviets, the Russians, they've got their submarines. So there's that whole game going on. You have to worry. Are they going, if they can launch nuclear weapons, you have to be aware of where those submarines are. They're going to be aware of you are. And you've got this little dance that you're doing for decade after decade. In the deeps, in the dark, you're using your sonar to detect them. But then you detect this other stuff. I mean, I can't personally imagine something that would be creepier if I'm in a submarine a couple of 100 feet below the water, and you're getting sonar readings that are not an enemy submarine or any other submarine. And this is what happened. So how could they not take that to the highest level of seriousness? It's like, this is great mystery. It's this great unknown thing and high drama. So, fascinating.
And the activity just keeps going. If I had a nickel for every sailor that stops me on the street or calls me and tells me about their encounters with these, strange phenomena. There was one female, I don't think we released this interview, but I won't even identify the ship. It's one of our Navy ships. She was, on the main part of the control center of the deck that was up, and you could see outside, and a craft came down, shined a light so bright, her exact description, which is recorded, so one day we should release this, George. She looks at her hand, and it was so bright, she couldn't see her hand in front of her. It was like a very bizarre, it was just so bright. And this happened, I think, in the Arabian Sea. These encounters with our military ships are so much more prevalent than is ever reported. And that happens in the South China Sea, that happens with swarms on the West Coast, on the East Coast. I mean, if I could report on everything that we get modern day, it happens all the time. It's not just 2019 that George and I reported on. It's not just that. It's happening to this day. It's been happening throughout history. But you've seen, Richard, you've seen how people over time, they want to take care of their families. They don't want to break from the fold. They don't want to come out. Even Commander Fravor is like a big deal to talk about it until he was, out of the military.
Yeah, they're afraid. And that's so true. That's so true what you say. And by the way, I would love to hear some of those stories myself from you. But one thing that I noticed with these Navy stories, this is almost typical. In fact, it is typical that the way that I would find them, and I have a lot of U.S. Navy stories in all these 3 volumes. Classic incidents would be like a guy would write 25 years, 30 years after the fact to something like the National UFO Reporting Center. Sometimes anonymously, sometimes they give their name, but they would always say, yeah, I was in the Navy back in 1973, and I was in this body of water on this ship, and this crazy thing happened, and I've never talked about it till now. That's classic. So they know they're not supposed to, or they were told not to talk about it, typically. But then they do. Like, time goes on, and they're either like, I'm sick and tired of this, or I'm just people that need to know, or for whatever reason, and they end up talking about it. But that's so typical for U.S. Navy personnel. And you can understand why, because it's just, there's a lot of pressure, there's a lot of fear, there are career repercussions for these people, and it's no surprise that they don't want to jeopardize any of that.
Did you see George's footage from his Netflix show where that object, and I was like highly skeptical. I talked to the guy Rory that was out there. Did you see that footage of that object appearing to go into the water and illuminate underneath the water on his Netflix?
I don't know if I caught a lot of those episodes, and I'm now embarrassed. I think I trailed off in the middle of it, but I'm not done, so I'll come back. It's on Netflix. It's great. I like it very much. The last time I left off, you were down at the Mexican coast there in the Gulf of Mexico, and you were out with some of the guys in a boat.
Right.
And I remember that, and they were detecting strange anomalies, but I don't remember a large illuminated object, so that may be later.
It's pretty awesome.
Yeah, we caught video of it going into the water. I mean, it put on a little performance. I'll send you, there was an analysis done by another group online, and they did an analysis of the object, blew it up, but I'll send it to you.
Thanks. Well, I'll go check it on the Netflix episode, because it is good, and I'm a little embarrassed here now that I have to say I don't think I saw that one.
Who's got time to watch everything, man? But it's a cool case, and it's important. We did a weaponized on it.
The Gulf of Mexico is active, as I'm sure you both are aware. There are some very, very fascinating cases that I found, and some recent ones too.
Sorry, what did you call it?
The Gulf of America.
Your book makes a great point about certain hotspots, that being one of them. The Bermuda Triangle, for all the furor over whether that's a legitimate mystery or not. Off of Puerto Rico, off of Southern California, you have some great information about the nature of these hotspots. It suggests that maybe there's a base there. That's why people see them so often in the same spot. Could we detect them if there's a base there? I know you make the point in the book that only 5% of the deep ocean has been sort of mapped, the floor of it, I think. And I know that there's some current mapping exercises that they're trying to cover the whole thing. Would we be able to see them if we were actually looking?
I don't know. I mean, so one area where I would look for a base would be the massive deep Puerto Rico Trench, which goes down more than 5.5 miles. And I doubt that our mapping project is going to get down to the bottom of that. Maybe they will. Who knows? I don't know. We have a long way to go before we can map that whole floor. So the ocean floor, I think I learned this from Tim Gallaudet, so this is what he said to me. 25% of the ocean floor, 5% of the volume. I'm thinking even 5% of the ocean volume, that's a lot. That's a lot of volume, but only 5%. So, there's a lot of opportunity to find a base, I would imagine, but personally, I looked for any kind of hint of alien bases. And the best that I could find were a number of researchers over many years offered their conviction that there was a base in this location or that location. So one, I think pretty much everyone thinks that there's a base near Puerto Rico. I would say probably to the north of that island is my best guess. That island is like the king of USOs. There's just so much activity going on there, particularly in after the 1970s. It's just crazy. Catalina Island, the whole Channel Island area is obviously very active. In fact, I'd say the whole California coast is very, very active, going right down to Baja, down by where the Nimitz was. But then what most people don't really think about in terms of at least the Western Hemisphere is the northeastern coast of the U.S. It's incredibly active there, going up into Canada as well. When I had all my little pins from my Google Earth for every little case that I tracked, and that area is extremely dense. The Gulf of Mexico, I'm just going to call it that, very active. And then leaving the Western Hemisphere, or South America, near Buenos Aires, I think there's a lot of reason to think there might be a base there. Going over to Europe, I know there were European researchers who believed there was one in the Bay of Biscay, which is off the coast of France in the Atlantic. Maybe. The Black Sea, I would absolutely say yes, I would believe that. Looking at a lot of Soviet cases that I studied. And then somewhere in or around the South China Sea, I don't know exactly where it would be, but I think there's got to be something there because there's a lot of activity out in that part of the Pacific.
Can I ask one more question, Jeremy, and then you take it from there? Richard, you mentioned the Bay of Biscay. There's a case in your book looking at some really old incidents, something far, far back, I forget what the year is, but where something came out of the water and fried people. It burned animals, it burned people. Could you recall the details of that one?
Oh, God. No, I can't, actually.
Okay.
Oh. Yes. This might be one from 1740. I don't know if that's what you're thinking of, George. If this is not the one, then...
It's 949, year 949. Bay of Biscay in Spain.
Yes. Okay. So this one, I was a little skeptical of it, so I'm just going to say that here. So I looked at a lot of early potential USO cases. And I was not bound by saying I'm going to start in this year and ignore everything before that. No, I wanted to find out what are the earliest really solid cases that worked for me, that I thought I could get behind this. So there was one from the year 949. It's over 1,000 years ago. And it actually was something that initially came off the coast of northern Spain and then came down, hit a bunch of cities that spanned over like a couple of 100 miles and caused all kinds of damage to buildings and people and animals. So here's my problem with this case. First of all, communications in the year 949 were not good. Very difficult. So that's one thing just to keep in mind. Doesn't mean nothing happened. Something could have happened. But we're talking about a fireball that was said to rise out of the sea and then cut through a path almost 200 miles inland. I mean, really significant, or maybe over 100 miles inland. That there was a city called Zamora that received a lot of damage, supposedly. Now, here's what I know. In 949, Spain, that part of Spain especially, was the scene of a lot of fighting between Spanish Christians and Muslims who were occupying a lot of the country. There's warfare going on, and there was a lot of warfare going on between all of those Spanish kingdoms, including the Basque people, who were always irreconcilable, but a whole bunch of others. And one of those towns that was hit by a big fireball, supposedly, was conquered a couple of years later by the Muslims. I mean, when I look at a case like this, I'm like, does this really strike me as a genuine craft or something that really came out of the water, goes 100 miles inland? And I'll just be honest and say I was a bit dubious about that. So I discussed it, but I did not include it as a genuine case.
Same thing about Christopher Columbus. That's a fairly well-known incident in UFO world that Columbus saw something.
He did.
What do you make
He
of
wrote
it?
about it. Yeah, no, that's a little more. That's a stronger case, and I include that. The late Stanton Friedman always said, "I keep that in my gray box. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's in the gray box." So I'll say the Columbus sighting for me is in my gray box. So what happened was Columbus and his 3 ships, they were less than 1 day from sighting land. So sometimes people forget they were like very close to the island that is now Haiti and Dominican Republic, Hispaniola. So the night before, or like less than 24 hours before, he sees this light, and it's kind of bobbing up and down a little bit. It's kind of going back and forth. He doesn't know what it is. One of the other crew members of his ship saw it equally well. Columbus wrote all about it. And that's about all that we have of it. And he told his son about it. His son wrote about it a couple of years later as well. So we have a couple of things about this. And I don't know what this was that he saw. Like, there's a couple of theories. Did he see bioluminescence? I don't think so. I give my reasons why. Was Columbus fooled by the ship that was probably ahead of him? They may have had lights. That would have been a rookie mistake for a guy like Columbus, who was one of the best sailors of his generation. I doubt he would have been fooled by that. Could it have been a light from land? That's possible, except he was probably, I tried calculating all of this. This is crazy. I think he was probably, the curvature of the Earth might have been a little too much to see a light at that time, unless they were on an elevation like a hill, which could have been the case. So I don't really know what he saw. I have no idea. I would say there's a decent likelihood that he saw something on land. I think it's entirely possible. He was close enough to have seen something, but the fact is, even that's not the best explanation, and I just don't know what he saw. So it is a mystery, and I did think like it deserves to be written about, except I didn't include it as a formal case, but I did want to do my best to discuss it.
You wrote somewhere in your book, you said a handful of encounters indicated attempted USO retrieval operations.
Yeah.
That's a big talk right now is, where have we retrieved these from? Do you have one case that stands out for you when it comes to USO retrieval operations?
Yeah, none of them are rock solid strong, in my opinion. They all have different holes in them and weaknesses. There's 2 I'll mention. I'll try to be efficient here. So one was a case from 1962 in the Pacific near Johnston Island or Johnston Atoll. It's about a couple hundred miles from Hawaii. And during 1962, the U.S. did a lot of nuclear detonations out in that area. And it was called Operation Dominic. It's got a Wikipedia page and all of that. So one gentleman who I spoke to at length, his name is out there, he's known, his name is David Noble Whitehorse. He's a great guy. He served aboard a USS Navy vessel in 1962. They were doing nuclear detonations, and he had a whole story that actually wrote about previously, where he believes, and it does look like, he said we would have bogeys and UFOs every single time before there was a detonation, because he was participating in a bunch of these, which were going on at the time. He said they would all disappear before the detonation, except this one time. He said one craft apparently did not get out of town fast enough, and it went down, and it was tracked. He actually saw it go down with some of his shipmates, and he discussed an attempted retrieval operation with someone that he met years later at a bar at Guantanamo Bay. 2 Navy guys talking, and he believed that this was the diver who was sent the next day to do a reconnaissance of it. I've since thought about that case, and my question is, where the hell are you going to go down? I mean, the Pacific Ocean down there is 3 miles or more. You can't bring a diver down there. It's not possible. So I don't know where they would have been, unless he was like right at the coast of one of these atolls. I don't know where they would have been. That said, that was a failed USO retrieval attempt, according to David. I spoke to another guy who was a former Navy person who, everyone gets their story secondhand. So he was at the International UFO Congress about 10 years ago. Awesome place to hang out, where they were having it at that time. And he chatted with the Southern Navy guy. And the Southern Navy guy said, yeah, I served aboard the USS Nautilus. So the Nautilus was the first nuclear-powered submarine, very important. And he said the Nautilus had a refitting in the mid-60s, which turns out that's true. And he said the refitting allowed it to have a hatch that would open that would allow you to take in certain USO craft, as long as they were smaller than a certain size. And he said we took in a couple of them, a bunch of them. So, now that's interesting. I did a whole deep dive into, like, is it possible for a submarine to retrieve these things? Where could a sub retrieve them? You'd have to be on an ocean shelf. You couldn't retrieve these at the bottom of the floor. You'd need a claw for that. Maybe they would use claws. But there's a lot of ocean shelf that would be worthwhile that a submarine, in theory, could retrieve. You know, if you're less than 1,000 feet below the surface, a submarine can go there, and it could be possible. And I just did whatever research I could, but about 10% of our oceans are where you have a shelf, so it's shallower. You're not going down to the deep waters there. And it could be entirely feasible that you could do a retrieval operation with a submarine in the shelf areas. And that could be also, you know, the Shag Harbor case of 1967. All that water there, this is off the coast of Nova Scotia, that's all super shallow there. You're not into deep ocean. And the Nautilus was back in action in 1967, and it operated in the Atlantic waters. I actually thought it might have been possible that the Nautilus could have been sent to do a potential retrieval of whatever went down at Shag Harbor in 67, but I'm just speculating there. But I think it would have been entirely possible that they would have been tasked with going there. But as far as retrieving these things, I don't think there's any question that if you're the U.S. Navy, you would absolutely do anything you could to retrieve these things, just like you would if they were on land. I don't think there's any question about it. We just need confirmation.
Graham Bethune. That's a name that I learned when I first took a dive into the UFO subject. A really classic case.
Totally.
Again, one that's largely been forgotten. Can you share with our listeners what the details were about that, why it's important?
You bet. I was really jazzed. I got to meet Graham Bethune back in 2004. That was a long time ago. He was still around. I think I was in New Jersey. Can't remember. Anyway, because Graham Bethune was a U.S. Navy pilot in 1951. And he talked about this many times. This is a very well-known account. People can research this. So they're flying back from, I think, Greenland or Iceland. He's past Greenland, and they were heading into North America with a bunch of high-level Navy brass on the ship, or some fairly high-level people. And what he has said is this: him and his crew. So it's dark, it's nighttime. They're past Greenland, headed toward Canadian waters. And an object, a lighted object, seems to come out of the water. Now, he's up in the air. This is how it looked. There was nothing down there. Suddenly there's a light. And within a couple of seconds, that light is right next to their aircraft. It's like right there. And they're looking at it, he and his crew, and it's a flying saucer. He's describing it in detail. It's got various types of lights. He could see what distance it was. It was very close for quite a while, right at their wing. And Bethune's attitude was, I have no desire to report this. There is no way in hell I want to have this hassle. Like, this is the typical attitude of all of these pilots back then. But this object was with them for the longest time, and it maneuvered around the aircraft more than once. First it's on one wing side, then it's on the other wing side. This thing was incredibly maneuverable, and it just seemed to be checking them out, as far as he could tell. This went on for quite some time, and then it just took off, and it was gone. When he landed, he talked a lot about this too. There were, I think they were CIA people, or they might have been some other military intelligence, and I can't quite remember which. Or maybe he didn't even know. I'm not sure. I'll have to look at the account. But he said one thing that they did is they showed us pictures. He said they knew a lot more than they were letting on, and they wanted to know every single thing that we noted about this craft. They were very, very, very interested in it. So that was Graham Bethune. That was in February of 1951. And I've always thought that was a heck of a case. Got to meet the guy. He was a very impressive man, if I may say. Even but at this point, this is half century after his encounter. He was an elderly gentleman. But he was extremely dignified. You could tell he was highly known.
You also mentioned a name that Jeremy and I are very familiar with, Bill Cooper. Of course, Bill Cooper is known now for his book, Behold a Pale Horse, or as some people say, Behold a Pail of Horse Shit.
Yeah.
Bill, he had a way of allowing facts to not get in his way. But you note that the incident that he described, which is sort of how he started down the road of looking into UFOs, that might be a real incident.
Yeah, I think so. I had a long conversation years ago with Don Ecker of UFO Magazine. Great guy.
Yep.
Don Ecker was like, Cooper's full of shit. Don't believe him. And Don really knew what he was talking about. It's like, I respect what he has to say here. And it's true. It's like, when you read Cooper, the thing that really made me convinced Cooper was full of it was this whole thing with the JFK assassination.
Yep.
We don't have to get into that, but that was just a load of crap, honestly. But I don't know if he had the ability to convince himself that these things were true. I do know, I remember listening to John Lear. You guys knew John Lear way better than me. But John Lear, I think, was afraid of Cooper at times. That's the impression he had.
With good reason, too.
Yeah, Cooper was packing weapons, and he was not stable. Then he dies in a shootout with federal marshals, so there's that. But anyway, so Cooper, we learned about Cooper, back in the late 80s with the basic bare-bones bulletin board systems that was on the internet. And he talked about being aboard a submarine called the USS Tiru in 1966. And when you read his description, I mean, there's actually nothing even sensational about how he describes it. You can see it's very factual in how he's describing everyone involved. So what he's saying is, submarine is surfaced, which it does, and they're out. It's a sunny day, and he's above, and he's with a couple of other guys, and they see this object come out of the water, and it's very big. And they watched it do this more than once. By the last time it was entering and exiting the water, they had brought the, I think it was the commander of the submarine who was with them watching this. They had binoculars. They had a really good view of this. And Cooper, he was a young guy at the time. And reading his account, there are things about Cooper where, over years that I would read, and I wouldn't believe certain things that he said. But this thing I've always believed. And you can take it or leave it. I mean, people can decide what they want. There's no FOIA documentation on it. I really know that I can absolutely prove it. But it is Cooper's story, and I just tend to think it strikes me as credible, and I thought I would include it.
I did the first TV interview with him in 1988. He came on with Lear.
Oh, wow.
Told the story about the JFK assassination, and then he had explained to us on the air that he's really scared. He's going to tell his story, and then he's disappearing forever, going into hiding. And, obviously that didn't happen. Within a month or so, he was charging $100 a head to have dinner with him and speaking at conferences. And each time he told the story, he got bigger and bigger than the time before. And anyone who criticized him, and Don Ecker and I worked on something similar together, if he criticized him, then suddenly he remembered seeing my name on the list of the secret cabal controlling the UFO story.
Well, with the JFK thing, I'll just say, I remember reading something that he said where he said, when I was in the Navy, in the early 70s, he said, we were briefed, my special group was briefed that the driver had shot Kennedy. And I'm like, sure you were briefed on that. Like, you were not briefed on that matter. And the analysis of the film, where it could look like it. That's like fifth generation copy of the VHS that was sent to John Lear. You guys know this story better than I do, by a Dutch filmmaker, I think, who was trying to get backing for his JFK thing, and he thought John Lear would do it.
Yeah, Lars Hansen.
Yeah, thank you. And anyway, I think Cooper was just that made me think, okay, but I do believe. I think his USO story, it always struck me as true. When you read it, you can't know for sure, but it strikes me as meticulous enough that I'm inclined to say, yeah, maybe it happened. And my illustrator did a depiction of that, which I thought.
Oh, the illustrations were terrific. Jeremy, you're the artist in the crowd. Those illustrations of these incidents were awesome.
Yeah, they were totally awesome. I grabbed a bunch of these. You had an illustration of one that sunk home with me. And I think I've mentioned this, Georgia, I've mentioned this before, which is that during the New Jersey drone swarms, a contact reached out and said, look, some of these are very explainable, people that are protecting critical infrastructure, I'll say, right? But some of these aren't. So there is footage of a pyramid-shaped object coming out of a river right next to a facility, a critical infrastructure facility, and hovering and loitering over that facility. I can attest there is footage, but it's highly guarded, and in fact, to date now, it's been scrubbed from the system, and I've been looking into that and what the system is. I think it's Honeywell, but it's no longer there for those employees to access it. But what was so interesting was it was described as pyramid in shape. And you don't hear that tons, but you did have a case in your book, and it was 1767 in Scotland. And I have like some of the exact words. I want to read it and just get your opinion on it. An uncommon phenomena was observed on the water, preceded by a thick, dark smoke, which soon dispelled and discovered a large, luminous body, like a house on fire, but presently, after it took that form, something pyramidal. And it talks about how it rolled and went up the river and all that stuff. And it did some crazy shit with like a person and a horse. But
Yeah.
my question to you is, that's how many times do you hear about the pyramid in shape?
Not many. That's very rare. A couple of these shapes are like common ones: disc, cigar, sphere. Get some triangles. The pyramid, no, it's much more unusual. And that particular one, that's a place at a little river called Cooper Angus, up in Scotland. And this is a river, a little, not even a big river. It's a small little river, but sometimes this does happen. That's a very strange case because it's written in that's a very meticulous account. There's no reason to dispute it. What the heck was that thing? I have not the slightest clue. I just don't know.
Yeah.
But it's good enough. It is detailed enough that it's got to. People ought to know what it is. Maybe I don't know what kind of naturalistic explanation that could be. Honestly, I have no idea. Some of these kind of make sense, even if you're thinking of ETs or aliens that are here, and some of them don't easily make a lot of sense. Like I'm trying to figure out, like what's your plan here? Coming out of this little river, burning some of these things along the way. Like, what are you trying to do? And I just can't figure that one out.
Richard, did you get into Colares in Brazil at all for one of the volumes?
Yeah. That's going to be in the second volume. And I'll talk a little bit about this. So one thing that I've learned in tracking these cases, and this was a little bit of a surprise at the time, was that one decade had so many more USO cases than any other, and that was the 1970s. And like, it's crazy because this is pre-internet. It's like, it's not the easiest thing to report a case back then compared to today. And by the way, the 2010s were the second biggest decade, so we've had some recent decades that are quite active. But anyway, the 1970s were just massively active. A lot of electromagnetic cases, like interference cases. But anyway, Colares, Brazil, is at the mouth of the Amazon River there. There's massive flow of water coming out into the Atlantic Ocean there. And as a lot of people who study this subject do know, in 1977 and 1978, there were a series of truly awesome and sometimes fatal encounters that people there had. There was a UFO journalist researcher named Bob Pratt who was very active in investigating this. Jacques Vallée got down there. He wrote about it. We know about what happened in Colares to a large extent. The Brazilian military sent an officer down there to do an investigation. His name at the moment escapes me, but we know who he is. Talked about it. So there were cases of objects coming in low, burning people, causing illnesses and sickness. But there were a few cases also of objects coming out of the water there. And so those were ones that I included in that study. And that will be discussed at some length in the second volume of this series, which will be out less than 2 months, I'm pretty sure. Maybe in half, I'm hoping.
Jeremy, you better book Rich for that show then, 2 months from now. Although, Tic Tac comes later, I wanted to raise it now in the sense of, Dave Fravor had told us, we've interviewed him on this program a couple of times and elsewhere, he had said he saw something under the water, something really big, about the size of a 747, that was kind of churning under the water where the Tic Tac was bouncing around up in front of it. But as Jeremy, who did some pretty deep digging in, has found, the sensor systems that should be able to see something that big of the U.S. Navy didn't see anything. And I just wonder if you could address the idea that if they don't want to be seen, they're not seen, either visually or on sensors or anything else. Nobody picked up that there was a large object down there, although Dave Fravor says he saw it. And, the fact that the Tic Tac was there, sometimes they could lock onto it. There were multiple objects over a couple of weeks, and other times they could not. Same thing with the 2019 incidents where the USS Omaha was surrounded by 12 to 14 of these fairly big things. They disappear from radar, zip in, zip out. Could you address the general idea, if they don't want to be seen, we're not going to see them?
Yeah, probably. I think that's probably more true than not, generally speaking. I mean, we do detect them often enough, but a lot of times they seem to just wink out. In the case of the Nimitz encounter from 2004, I'm with you guys. I think there's a very good reason to consider that as a USO case. There is eyewitness testimony to this coming from Fravor, even though I know he has publicly said no, there's no USO there, but there's been a lot of other talk about that case coming from different quarters that have supported this idea of a large object under the water, and I think it's true. But these things can be very elusive, extremely. So, for example, starting in the late 60s through the 1970s, we know that the Soviet Navy encountered these things that they called, I'm sure I cannot pronounce this properly, but in English it's spelled kavakari, and it's the Russian word for croaking, or like frogs croaking. And the reason they call them that is because these things gave a sound with the sonar that sounded like a croaking sound that you'd get with a frog. And so they called it that. And for more than a decade, at least, Soviet submarines encountered this. And the things would appear, they would track along with the sub for a certain period of time and then just disappear. And they could not figure out where the hell these things went to. So there's definitely a mysterious element to these craft under the water. I don't think there's any question they have this ability. Plus, they can go at speeds vastly beyond the fastest submarines we have. I mean, on occasion, they have been tracked going in well beyond 100 knots, sometimes more than 200 knots under the water. Submarines can't do that. So they're elusive. And I do think, overall, if they don't want us to detect them, we're probably not going to. Although our technology is getting better and better. I mean, one of the things that I learned in the course of doing this project is the advances of naval technology and just having sensors, sonar systems in the water, the system known as SOSUS. I learned a lot about that, and these other methods by which they can detect things. So they've become, much more sophisticated in a pretty brief period of time. I've got to think that they are detecting a number of these objects, but they don't like to talk about it. That is for sure. The Navy does not like to talk about this.
My question is just, what are they doing? This is something, if you listen to the first interview that I did with Commander Fravor, I asked him, what were these things doing? And that is when he was describing that there was a cross-shaped object that appeared to be under the water, even though the white water was circular. And I think he kind of backs away from things that he doesn't know for sure. So I think that's why he's kind of coy about if there was something under the water. He can tell you there was white water that was above, and it was circular. And the moment that Tic Tac left, that white water started dissipating. But originally, he told me straight up, and others have said too to me, that they believed it was docking. That was their word, docking with something, even if it's just information docking. What's always kind of bothered me, and I know we can't, figure this riddle out here right now, but what were they doing? They were doing a job. Whatever was going on, they were up extreme altitudes. They would loiter at about 20,000 feet, then they drop down instantaneously. They were doing something. It was almost as if they were just discovered by Commander Fravor and the Black Aces when they were tasked to go out there. But what were they doing? What could the possibilities be of what they were docking with and what they were doing? We can't answer it, but it drives me crazy.
I suspect that because the Nimitz encounter, it's an incredible encounter. It's one of the best documented ones of all time, and it's rightly as famous as it is. But it's one of many military encounters. It's not the only one. And in all of the preceding ones and the later ones, what it looks like to me, the intelligence is operating these objects. They're interested in us, and they're interested in the capabilities of the U.S. Navy. I believe, so for example, we mentioned the USS FDR earlier. That was a very important ship, and that ship we know had numerous encounters with UFOs and USOs. I personally think, if you put it from the perspective of an alien presence that's here, let's just say they have a presence in the ocean. They have got a presence out of the ocean too, but they're down there, and they see in the space of a couple of generations, we human beings went from having no ability to detect them whatsoever and basically no presence in the deeps to suddenly having a significant presence in the deeps and having likely the potential of detecting them. I can imagine that they would be very interested in tracking all of the new things that these humans are doing, particularly so when these humans are themselves engaged in warfare that has nothing to do with the aliens. The US and the Russians, goes back a long way. There's always this tension. There's always this threat that we could have a nuclear holocaust. This is not a trivial threat. And even if you're a super intelligent, powerful alien group, if the humans decide to have a nuclear war, maybe that will affect you as well if you're here. So I could imagine they are interested in what we are up to. And I have this is only my suspicion, but in 2004, we were just beginning the global war on terror. That was all early stages. I don't know what the specifics of that naval exercise were that they were doing at that time, but it wouldn't surprise me that it would be important or that it would involve cutting-edge technology. And one thing that we know, of course, is that the communications of that fleet were highly encrypted. And when they go to the cap point, 50, 60 miles away, that craft was there before our guys were there, and that should not have been possible. So they were able to decrypt. Correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like they were able to decrypt, or they wouldn't even need encryption or decryption tech, who knows? But they were able to figure things out that defeated our most advanced encryption technology. So they seem to be conversant with our leading tech, and I suspect they're interested in it, and they're just taking notes.
We've seen technological leaps where we, humans, the U.S. in